بسم الله الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما اللهم افتح إلينا حكمتك وانشر علينا رحمتك يا ذا الجلال والإكرام ونعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم بسم الله. So was there any question from the last session?
I think I just have one with regards to the universals, it being kind of pushed away from the agenda, and the particulars kind of being pressed mainly.
So the universals concerning the subject matter, or just like universals in general?
No, like just the current crisis that we have today.
Like what we're experiencing right now.
I guess that was a tangent point with regards to education, but that's how we veered off from missing out on the universals.
So those universals, it will depend on exactly what lens you look at it as. Then you would apply the kind of universals from that particular lens, whether it's an eschatological lens, or it is from a medical lens, from a political lens, and then you would analyze it accordingly. And the idea there is to have like a holistic approach to the whole situation. So any circumstance, the ulama would look at it from a holistic perspective. Okay, this is the circumstance, this has occurred, what should we do? So they would look at it, okay, what does the hadith say? And then what does the Quran say? What does the hadith say? What are the other ulama saying? Should we approach it from this angle or from that angle? So, and then the decisions would be made accordingly. And this is how I believe the earliest Muslims observed their deen. And a very good example is Umar ibn al-Khattab, when he suspended the hudud punishment during the time of when there was a famine. And his approach was a very usuli approach. It was not, if you look at it, it was not a fiqhi approach. So he was not approaching it from the particulars, even though he was dealing with a particular situation. His approach was universal, and the argument was very sound, that if we are going to punish people for committing crimes of which they are desperate for, then everyone would be walking around without their right hands, with their right hands being chopped off. So he approached it from a very universal perspective. Now the difference between universals and particulars is like, you could look at a universal such as, let's take the human being for example. Every human being has the same outward forms. Everyone has a face, everyone has limbs, everyone has a body. All those are universals. To say that a head, a body, hands and legs, those are universals, right? But then every individual, every human being is a particular of that overall group, in that everyone will have a different sized head, a different size hands, different limbs. They'll have a different kind of a body, a torso. Like some people will be a bit broad, some will be thinner. So those are particulars, but the universal is applicable to every particular, in that sense that every individual is a particular of that universal group that is human beings, and they all share a universality. They all share a head, they all share limbs, they all share a body. So the universal can be applied to every single individual, but then in the particulars they will differ. Now, in terms of education, when you look at the overall curricula of academia, you have, in every field of study, you have subjects of study. The field of study is the universal in academia. The subjects of study are the particulars. And then in every subject of study, you've got particulars of particulars. So you'll have topics, then you'll have subtopics, and so on and so forth. So in the field of study of, say, science, the science is a universal in academia. And then in sciences, you've got the different subjects. Those are the particulars that fall under that group of universality of science. So you have physics, biology, chemistry, to name the three primary divisions. Then in those individual subjects, which themselves are particulars, you have particulars of particulars. So you'll have sub-subjects in those fields of study. So in probably in physics, you will have Newtonian physics and quantum physics. And then you will have like astrophysics. And then in those specific fields, in those specific particulars, you'll have other particularities. Now, if you look closely, you can apply the universal aspects between the sciences. For instance, if you're studying biology, you will also be studying the physical composition of the body. You will also be studying the chemical composition of the body. And yet, the physical composition has to do with physics and the chemical composition has to do with chemistry. But you can't apply the particulars in their concepts across. For instance, if you're studying cells and organisms, then talking about gravity, which is a concept in physics, really has no place when you're studying it in biology. Or if you're studying molecular structures of, let's say, different chemical compounds, then you really have no business talking about things like speed and displacement and vector and all those physical concepts. So that's where you could distinguish universals and particularities in the education aspect of it, in academia. The issue that we take with modern education compared to traditional education, I mean, there are a lot of issues with the traditional education systems, which academics will argue with validity on that. Certain aspects have to be changed and certain aspects have to be refined. And that goes into a field of study called subject pedagogy and things like classroom management and so on. But the issue with modern education is, what is the primary drive of education? Like, what does education entail? In the traditional sense, education entailed learning or acquiring knowledge for the sake of knowledge, in that the Muslims did not look at acquisition of knowledge to be in tune with career development or livelihood. In other words, they did not study sciences and arts and all these to enable them to push further in their careers, in their jobs. They pursued knowledge for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of understanding, and for the sake of growth, personal, individual growth, spiritual growth. Unfortunately, what's being used today, if you want to look at the definition of knowledge, of education today, the education being given to our children, and that was given to us as well, was not for the sake of knowledge. It was for the sake of getting into the workhorse, right? Getting into the workforce, sorry. It's getting into that mode of where exactly are you going to place yourself in this big machine of industry. So you learned the particularities, and what they teach you are the particulars, the semantics, the technical aspects, the instructions to follow or the procedures to follow, insofar as them being, insofar as you being able to be placed in a particular position at the point of you completing your education. So education today is not for the sake of knowledge. It is for the sake of industry. It is for the sake of job. It is for the sake of career. And so what educators tend to do is they forget that true learning is actually the understanding of universals. Because when you understand universals, you can apply universals to any particular circumstance that you are in. Unfortunately, they are more focused on that very specialized aspect of where you're going to place yourselves. And so their teaching is targeted towards that specific aspect. So you will only learn physics, biology, and chemistry if you want to be in the medical field. And those three subjects are perceived as not being useful or valuable in any other field of study or any other job or career placement. So why, in the argument, their epistemological argument is that why do you need to know universals if you're never going to apply them or if you're never going to use them? So What does somebody who is working in, let's say, accounting in a bank have to do with physics, biology, or chemistry, right? Arguably, yes, they don't really use that knowledge in their particular job, but does that mean we should completely negate and remove this idea of acquiring knowledge just for the sake of knowledge and understanding? Children who go into school eventually at the end of their education they turn out to be smarter and more educated and they become more academically proficient in their understanding. Well, arguably, yes, but think about it this way. What exactly is being indoctrinated into the children? See, the persona that is developed in them based on the language that they are indoctrinated with. They're not told that in life they can be whoever they want to be, like who they want to be. They're not given this idea that they have to actually explore their inner selves and become who they were meant to be. This is an underlying issue in philosophy, which is the problem of identity. Um, that what's your purpose of existence? How do you come to understand what your purpose of existence is? What they're being taught is they can be anything they want to be. So they're basically being turned into an object. So you can be a carpenter or a firefighter or a policeman or a superhero or a Marvel's Avenger or anything you want to be is what's being indoctrinated in these children. And so what they're being taught is not the universal understanding of what knowledge is. All they're being taught is what information entails. Now, knowledge is a universal, information is a particular, because information is what you use to compound an understanding through which you arrive at knowing something. And that's when you acquire knowledge. You use the particulars to formulate an understanding of the universal, right? So if they're only being indoctrinated about whatever they can be in terms of turning their understandings into something that is more material related, in terms of you can be anything you want to be, and this is the statement that they will always use to children, and it's very unfair. It's an injustice to the children to be given that sort of a persona, that you can be anything you want to be. No, we don't want to be anything that we want to be. We don't want to be things, right? We don't want to be objects of society. We want to understand why we are here in this world. Why do we exist in this world? That's what we want to understand. That is ma'rifah. And we want to arrive at ma'rifah. And if you look very closely in our religion, the scriptures never speak in particulars. The scriptures don't give you semantics and technical details. The scriptures always speak in universals, because once you understand the universal, you can go into any circumstance and you will be able to apply that universal. And you can look at any particular out there and see what is the coherency of truth with the universal, and you will be able to distinguish between truth and falsehood. You will be able to do the firaq. And so the Quran is called Al-Furqan, right? Why is it called Al-Furqan? Because it is the criterion by which truth and falsehood can be distinguished. And this is a world of this turbulence between truth and falsehood. It's a world of possibilities and impossibilities. And so the human being needs to be able to understand, to distinguish the particularities of this world. What are the particulars of truth? How to distinguish them from the particulars of falsehood? And then arrive at a universal understanding of what is true and what is false, so that you can better understand yourself and come to that ma'rifah. This is what Ghazali is talking about in this book. He's talking about you coming to know yourself so that you can ultimately arrive at knowing and understanding your Lord, right? And how do you come to know yourself? You don't know yourself through the particularities of yourself, through your body parts and through your physical composition. That's not knowing yourself. That's just knowing your body. And knowing yourself is more of an inward reality. And that inward reality is a universal. Now, Muslims tend to make this mistake as well, because this is what we have now done with our religion. We have delineated it into something that is just nominal, right? We've delineated it into a set of rules and dogmas and doctrines which are perceived as dogma and doctrine. So really, Islam is looked at something of a fiqh. It's just perceived as fiqh, or is perceived as madhab, right? And when it comes to actually understanding even what fiqh itself is perceived as just jurisprudence. It's all about the law and how well you work around the law, right? That's not what religion is about. The religion is not there for doctrination, and it's not there for all these dogmas that we have to follow. These are guidelines that help you maintain the right path, but you need to understand why there is a religion. You need to understand why there is guidance. Why is there a Sharia? Why are you being told to do what you're being told to do? Why is this a prohibition? It's a very beautiful thing, and Ghazali's approach is beautiful in respect. When he writes, for example, by him writing the Ihya and his style of delivering the universals, he's giving you the Shari'i aspects, and not only is he telling you how you should follow them, he's explaining why you should do it, why you should fast, why you should pay zakat, why you should pray. He's giving you the usul, and the usul is the universal. The fiqh is the particulars. And this is why there are differences of opinion in the fiqh, because everyone's understanding is different. And fiqh means understanding. Fiqh, the fuqaha are men who understand. They are those who understand the religion. They are those who understand the sharia. So fiqh itself also, it being a particular, is not the sharia. The sharia is the universal. The fiqh is the particular, and every particular is different. So my point here is that if we focus only on the particulars, how are we going to know which one is right? You see, if we get caught up in the semantics and the technicalities, then we will always just be going back and forth between technicalities and semantics. Such and such is saying this, but such and such is saying this. And then such and such is also saying this. How do you know which one is right? Right? Unless you understand the universal, then you'll be able to distinguish which one is actually closest to the truth. Because we could say that somebody's smart. Yeah, definitely. They've got a lot of information and they can recall a lot, because human beings are intelligent. But being smart does not entail being intellectual, and doesn't necessarily entail being knowledgeable. People can have the ability to recall a lot of information and deliver that upon demand. A lot of scholars coming out of universities, they're very proficient as far as like the fiqh is concerned. You can ask them a question, they'll be able to give you a solution as they recall from what they were taught. But here's the thing, do they actually understand that particular notion that they're giving you, that decision that they're giving you, or that opinion they're giving you? No, they don't. Most of them don't. Even considering the current situation right now, a lot of fatwas being passed to do this and do that, and it's permissible to do this and permissible to take the vaccine, and it's permissible to inject yourself and all these things, but they don't actually understand exactly what's happening. And that's plain and clear from their behaviors. And they're the first ones to go out and get an inoculation, which they don't actually know where it's coming from. They haven't bothered to even try and find out. They're dismissing any counter argument that comes to it without even examining the argument itself. They dismiss it as simple conspiracy theories, and Islam doesn't tolerate conspiracy, which is fine, arguably, but they haven't actually taken the time to understand. And it's because of that lack of understanding is why they might be smart as far as the information is concerned, as far as kitab is concerned, book knowledge is concerned. Because I can spend 2, 3 years, 4 years memorizing all the books, all the texts, and have everything recalled at my fingertips. And you can ask me a question, and I can give you an answer, right on the spot. But did I actually understand what I was studying? And am I doing you a favor by giving you an understanding of that knowledge? In other words, what do I actually have? Do I have a whole database of information that I have memorized? Or do I actually have knowledge? No, I don't have knowledge in that regard. Imam Malik said, ليس العلم كثرة الرواية. Knowledge is not the memorization of different opinions, of many opinions and narrations and data and information. He said, العلم نور يضيء الله في قلوب الناس في قلوب المؤمنين. That knowledge is a light, it's a nur that Allah places in the heart. And so once again, like as we are talking about this, you can see that once again I'm always coming back to the heart, and Ghazali is always coming back to the heart. It's because it's the heart that's the hub of understanding. The brain is just a processor of information. So when you're looking at, there's a difference between how the heart functions and how the intellect functions, even though the intellect is in the heart, because you can have all the information and all that information can be factually right, but doesn't necessarily make it true. You can have the subject knowledge of, let's say, logic, for example, and master the subject of logic and be considered a genius in logic, but that doesn't mean that your logical argumentation is going to be true. And Iblis is a very clear example of that. See, his logical explanation was, I am better than him because on the merit that fire is better than clay. Now, elementally, if you were to study that, fire does have better qualities than clay. Fire can do more than clay. But even though his logic was sound, his statement was false, and it was proven to be false because in his heart, while his intellect was articulating its best, his heart was diseased. The arrogance which was in his heart prevented him from seeing the truth. And so he did not actually have knowledge per se. All he had was the information that was available to him. And he perceived that information in the correct sense, but he did not understand it in its true essence, right? So sense and essence are two different things. And inshallah, we'll look at this in the كيمياء. He's going to talk about the senses, I think in the next or the following chapter. He's going to talk about the senses and what is the role of the senses with relation to the heart. This is how you will also understand what is the relation of information to knowledge, and ultimately what is the relationship between particulars and universals. And this is how, if I can just take another example to help you understand this difference between the particulars and universals. And in legislation, you have what's called the spirit of the law, and then you have the letter of the law. So the letter of the law is the particular law, and the spirit of the law is why that letter of the law is in place. And in the Islamic perspective, you would differentiate this between the Sharia and the fiqh. So the Sharia is universal, and if you look, in fact, the Islamic Sharia can be applied to the other faiths as well as a universal concept. But then in the particulars, they will differ. So this is why the fiqh is established from the Sharia. The Sharia is not established from the fiqh. Likewise, universals are not established from particulars. Particulars are established from universals. And with reference to our education system, unfortunately, what they're focused on teaching is the particulars, and they're not focused on teaching the universals. So they when they go into subject matter, they focus too much on the subject matter rather than the understanding of the subject itself. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Anything else? Okay, let me just proceed with Ghazali's Kimya al-Sa'ada, because now he's going to talk about the reality of the heart. So this The previous chapter that we finished was كيف تعرف نفسك? How would you know yourself? And from that, he concluded by saying that it is by knowing the heart is when you would know the self. Just to clarify one thing here, because of the terminology, it can become a bit confusing. There's a difference between self and soul, right? And this needs to be understood because the English language, I've said this many times, is deficient in the scholastic fields. When we're talking about soul, we're talking about the embodiment of it itself. We're talking about the soul as a body, as the essential body, as the object. When we're talking about the self, we're talking about the inner reality of that soul. So we're talking about the id or the I or the psyche, the attribute that has the consciousness, that does the conscious interaction with reality. So when we're talking about soul, when he says, and when you're looking at the Arabic also, when he's writing, it's important to distinguish between when he's saying nafs, is he talking about the soul as the ethereal body, or is he talking about the attributes which are the self? And this is important to distinguish also because we will look at this later on. He's going to talk about the inner dimensions of the self. When he talks about the ghadabiyya, the shahwaniyya, and the aqaliyya, these are not components like organs of the soul. These are actually dimensions of the self, right? And so when he's talking about aqaliyya, he's not talking about the intellect as a component. He's talking about the attribute of intellection that the self has. And this is also important when you're looking at the Quran, when the use of the term nafs has got so many different applications in the context of the ayah. Sometimes Allah could be just talking about the self, but sometimes he could be talking about the soul. So if we take an example in the ayah we talked about, sanurihim ayatina fil afaqi wa fi anfusihim, the nafs there is not the self, it is the soul in the soul, or sorry, the nafs there is not the soul, it is the self. He's talking about showing you the signs in themselves, in the self, because it is the self that is conscious, it is the self that is aware, it is cognizant, and it is through that cognition that it recognizes the signs. But the soul as the ethereal body doesn't do the thing or doesn't do the cognition independent of the self. The self is within the soul and it does the intellection. This is also vital when we talk about things like selfish, for instance. We say that the soul can be selfish and it can also be selfless, right? So the soul can take on the attribute of only looking after itself, or the soul can take on the attribute of looking out for others as well. So the selfishness or the selflessness is something that is cognizant. It's aware that it's doing that. It's something that it does consciously. And it can be selfish, means that it's only towards itself, or it can be selfless, meaning that it's towards others. So when we talk about nafs, and you'll see this even in the hadith a lot of the times, for instance, when the Prophet ﷺ says to kill yourself, right? Or not to kill yourself, to do jihad against the soul, against the nafs, and the word used is nafs. Jihad against the nafs. What does jihad against the nafs means? It doesn't, when you look at it, it feels like it may appear that you are fighting against your soul, but then you are your soul. You are the soul. So how would you fight against something that is you? And so you take from that to mean that you are fighting against the negative attributions of yourself. So nafs in this case is used primarily for that lower aspect of the human being, the lower aspect of the soul. This, when we go deeper into the metaphysics of the soul, we'll understand what is the difference between what the scholars call the rational self and the animal self. right? The lower self and the higher self. And Dr. Naqib al-Atas, he gives an excellent disposition in his Prolegomena. He says that true freedom is when the lower self submits to the higher self. In other words, the intellective aspect is in control of the lower animalistic aspects of the self, and the lower animalistic aspects are usually selfish. The higher aspect, intellective aspect, is selfless because it is able to think and able to regulate the emotions and the desires, and it is able to be considerate of not just itself but of everything else in creation. So it's important to also distinguish that even though nafs is sometimes used with a negative connotation, it has a lot of other positive connotations as well. That distinguishment has to be made. So inshallah, when we look more into the text of Ghazali, and as he's explaining all these individual components, this distinguishment will inshallah become clear enough. And that's the objective he's aiming for as well. He doesn't want you to think that the human being is a lower being, that the human self is a lower self. It's a negative thing altogether. He wants you to understand that this negative thing, this negative aspect or dimension of the self, can be regulated and can be refined and can be changed to become praiseworthy instead of being blameworthy. Theologically, this is also important because the Christians took this stance ultimately to say that man is inherently sinned, right? It has got an inherent evil in him, and that's because of these lower attributes. The Muslims don't believe that. The Muslims believe that the human being is a good creation with a good intent, because everything in Allah's creation has been created for good. Allah does not create things specifically, or like for instance, if we look at the human being, Allah did not create the human being to be evil. He created the human being to be good. And so this also goes back to understanding the what's known as the problem of good and evil. And in Islam, we say that good is a choice that the human being makes. Evil is not a choice. Evil is something that you capitulate to, you give in to it, you submit to it. In other words, you submit to your lower self, but you choose to rise above that. You choose to do good, right? And that's a praiseworthy quality because you are exerting your will to do good, right? So let me not get sidetracked, inshallah. Let's proceed with the text here. So now he's talking about haqiqatul qalb. And he says, Amma su'aluka ma haqiqatul qalb. So if you were to ask, what is the reality of the heart? And he says, فَلَمْ يَجِئُوا فِي شَرْعِيَّةِ أَكْثَرَ مِنْ قَوْلِ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. There is not much in the Sharia. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said, وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. That when they ask you about the ruh, tell them that the ruh is from the amr of my Lord. There's a reason why he's saying ruh here, even though he's talking about the qalb, because there's a point that he wants to prove, and he's going to prove that point, inshallah. So he says, لِأَنَّ الرُّوحَ مِنْ جُمْلَةِ الْقُدْرَةِ الْإِلَهِيَةِ. Because the ruh, in reference to that ayah, he's saying, and there's little knowledge about it that we have been given, is because the ruh is from the totality of the qudra of this divine qudra, this divine power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَهُوَ مِنْ عَالَمَ الْأَمْرِ. And it's from the عالم الأمر. قال الله عز وجل ألا له الخلق والأمر. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has said that to him belong the amr and the khalq. And the ayah he's referring to is in Surah Al-A'raf, ayah number 54. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that إِنَّ رَبَّكُمُ اللَّهُ الَّذِي خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ فِي سِتَّةِ أَيَّامٍ ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْأَرْشِ يُغْشِي اللَّيْلَ النَّهَارَ يَطْلُبُهُ حَثِيثًا وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ وَالنُّجُومَ مُسَخَّرَةٍ بِأَمْرِهِ أَلَا لَهُ الْخَلْقُ وَالْأَمْرُ Tabarakallahu Rabbul Alameen. This ayah, if you want to summarize the entirety of creation, what the components of creation are, how long it took to create them, and what are its legislative hierarchies. If you want to summarize all of that, this is the ayah that summarizes the entirety of that. So if you guys have something, maybe you can open up the ayah if you have the Quran with you there, and just follow the, I would say, just follow the wordings that I'm using. Let me know if you're ready. The ayah is in Surah Al-A'raf, ayah number 54. Okay, you guys are ready? Because I wanna break this down for you step by step. I know, because the question also Salih was asking before, and what we were talking about, the layers of the samawat. We're not going to be talking about the layers and how the samawat are layered on top of the earth. What I want to show you here in this ayah is what are the different components that have been highlighted in terms of the alam. Because in the end, he says, Tabarakallahu Rabbul Alameen. So that's what I want to show you. What does it mean? What is the alameen? What are the alameen made of? What are the different components? So, Inna Rabbakumullahu, indeed your Lord Allah, Alladhi khalaqa samawati wal ard. He created the samawat and the ard. Fi sittati ayamin, in 6 epochs. And 6 ages. These are 6 periods. So the process of creation, and I'm going to talk about this word process. It's going to come up in the next paragraph that Ghazali talks about. There is a process that the creation went through. And this process took place in 6 different stages and 6 different epochs. ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْعَرْشِ, and then he ascended upon the throne. يُغْشِي اللَّيْلَ النَّهَارَ يَطْلُبُهُ حَثِيثًا. The first component that he's talking about here is the planetary level. And in this planetary level, the process of time is cyclical of one instance into another instance. That's the night that follows into the day, and each one is seeking the other in rapidity. So there is a constant cycle of day and night. And this is a universal in the created universe, whereby there is always something occurring first and then something else occurring after that. So when there is good taking place, and then following that, there will be some darkness that takes place. There will be some khair, and then there will be some shar. You will be joyous, and then you will be sorrowful. It's never stagnant. There's always some changing taking place. And this is also cosmologically reflective of the heart itself, because the word qalb in Arabic, in the root word, means something that is changing. Like there is it's turning. It's constantly turning upside down. It's turning on it's this way, and then it's that way, and then it's this way. So sometimes you are thinking, sometimes you're feeling emotions, sometimes you are rational, sometimes you're irrational, sometimes you're this, sometimes you're that. You're always shifting about, right? So this is like the standard mannerism of the created world. There is always something occurring and something happening. Then he says, وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ. Then he's talking about the solar level. So you had the planetary level, now you've got the solar level. Then وَالنُّجُومِ, and that includes the stars and the galaxies. So you got these 3 levels that comprise the physical universe, right? Are you guys following me? Are you guys following me?
Yes.
Yeah. So you've got these 3 levels that comprise the physical universe. You've got the planetary level, and on this planetary level where life exists, there is this constant shift between light and darkness. There's a constant shift between day and night, between good and bad, between joy and sorrow, between pain and ease, right? Between difficulty and ease. So this cycle is continuum. There's always an up and a down and an up and a down, right? And then you've got the planetary level. That's where the Shams and Qamar comes in. Then you've got the Nujum, which constitutes the stars and galaxies. That's the stellar level of the universe, of the astrological universe. And he says, Musakharatin bi amrihi. They all of them, they are subservient to his amr. Now, this goes back to the arsh itself. Where does the amr come from? It comes from the arsh, because the arsh is the governing seat. It is the throne from which all this is governed. And he is above that throne, right? ثُمَّ اسْتَوَى عَلَى الْأَرْشِ. He is above that. That means he's not included in the laws and the rules that govern creation. And that means he's not affected by those laws. So he's not affected by time. He's not affected by gravity, by motion, by space, by cause and effect. He's not affected by any of those. He is above that. And he says, أَلَا لَهُ الْخَلْقُ وَالْأَمْرُ. To him belong the creation and the amr that governs the creation. So everything in creation is in a modus of doing something. And for it to do something, there has to be an intent to do. There has to be a will. The arguments that the atheists put forward, that everything is just random, right? Everything is just, it happens by itself. This is the counter argument that the Quran is giving. No, everything doesn't just happen by itself. There is a will that is making things happen. On a human level and a little bit on an animal level, these creations have got their own will that make things happen. They do things by their will, and those wills they have their own parameters. For other objects that are inanimate, the will is still in play, and it's Allah's will that makes it happen. So there is always an amr that is overlying or governing the khalq itself. And Tabarakallahu Rabbul Alameen. So blessed is Allah, the Lord of the Alameen. And now this is what we're looking at here in particular. Ghazali is saying that knowing the Alam leads you to know the Rabb who created the Alam. So the ultimate ma'rifah, and the only ma'rifah that is that the qalb is beneficial to the qalb. Everything else is, as far as the world is concerned, the only ma'rifah is ma'rifatullah. And that's what he's going to explain now in this section or in this chapter. Any question to that point?
No.
All good? Okay. So then he says, فَالْإِنسَانُ مِنْ عَالَمَ الْخَلْقِ مِنْ جَانِبٍ وَمِنْ عَالَمَ الْأَمْرِ مِنْ جَانِبٍ. So insan is from the alam, is from the created world in one aspect, and is also from the amr, from the alam al-amr in another aspect. And this is now what we were talking about last week, that you are in a very unique position and in between the material and the spiritual. You are in one aspect, you are a material creation, and then in another aspect you have got this spiritual side as well. فكل شيء يجوز عليها مساحة والمقدار والكيفية فهو من عالم الخلق. Now these three terms are very important. المساحة والمقدار والكيفية is saying that all these three are from the alam al-khalq. The thing that can be, it can occupy space, it can be measured, or it has an algorithm. If it's got these three components, it is from the alam al-khalq. That which can be measured, that which occupies space, and then that which can be measured. And kayfiya from the word kaifa is the howness of the thing. It's how the thing comes to be, its algorithm, how it comes to exist, which is a very interesting thing, because in material science, Material science can never explain why things exist. They can never give you an ontological explanation or a teleological explanation of something. If you ask a scientist why something is, like why do we breathe, guaranteed they'll always give you an explanation that has something to do with how the breathing actually takes place and doesn't actually explain why the breathing takes place. They'll tell you the body needs oxygen, so the lungs contract and expand and they draw in the air, and because the oxygen is required, so the brain sends the signal, and that's why we breathe. But what they're actually telling you is they're giving you an algorithm. They're giving you the process, the kayfiyah. That's the kayfa, how it is actually taking place. And in the Quran, Allah says constantly in many places, Alam tara kayfa khalaqa. Have you not seen how He has created everything? That how, the process of how everything came to be. That's the kayfiyah. Are you with me? Sorry?
Yeah.
Question on that?
The answer of the why question is Allah is the reason, or is it the who has the reason for all these processes to continue?
So the question, the why question in this regard, he's going to further explain later on, and he will say that it is the why question is what's called the ibar. When you do ibar on something and try to discern its inner reality, that is what gives you the why. It helps you understand the why. So one of the poets said, "Innamal kaunu ma'ani qa'imatun bis-suwar. Kullu man yudriku hadha kana min ahli al-ibar." That the world is meaning erected as form and structure. And whoever recognizes that is from the people of discernment. Because the discerning helps you understand the meaning of the thing and the purpose behind it and why it exists. So, and that's what he explains, that he says that later on, لأن العالم الأمر عبارة عن شيء من الأشياء لا يكون للمساحة والتقدير. That ibar, understanding the why, is now moving beyond the created realm and going into the realm of amr, to get to the point of understanding why something is. But insofar as the created world is concerned, if you only examine the outward portions of everything, the most you're going to get is its measurement, how much space it occupies, and how it actually functions in this world. Yeah? Just to elaborate a little bit further on this point, the amr is actually the will that drives an action forward. So part of the process of part of the khalq, the alam al khalq, is the processes that the amr goes through from the portion of kun into fayakun. So when Allah says be, that be, the kun, that's His amr, and it's His will that is being exerted. And the fayakun is the process of whereby the khalq is now undergoing the manifestation of that. So if you look closely in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ said, innamal a'malu bin niyat, that actions are contingent on the intentions. The intention is the amr. It's the will to do something. And the amal is the khalq portion of it, because that's where the action becomes manifested. Now, the amr is the thing that explains why the khalq is taking place. In other words, astaghfirullah. In other words, when you want to know why something is, why is there a tree in existence, the way you would come to understand why a tree exists is not by examining the process by which the tree came into being, because you can analyze the entire process from seed to sapling and then how it grows and how it becomes what it becomes. But that doesn't explain to you why it exists. Why did it take on that process? The way to understand why it took that process is to look at the amr. What is the command? Because the command is what helps you understand the will. So ultimately, by going through looking at the process, we have to now move from what's known in logic as min al-ma'lum ila al-majhul, from the known into the unknown. And in logic, we've got these three levels of questioning: the what, the how, and that also includes the whether question, whether this or that. And then the third level is the why. So this is tasawwur as-sadij, which is the first level, what is known as quiddity or mahiya, like asking what is it. So you have the object in front of you, that's what you are trying to examine, and you want to understand it, you want to understand its inner reality. That's tasawwur as-sadij, that's the outward perception, the naive perception, just grasping what the object is. Then you look at the process, the algorithm. How did it come to be? And you go through the ratification or the process until you arrive to a ratification. Is it this or that, right? So that's the whether or not question. Whether it's this or whether it's that. That takes you to where you are at a level of tasdeeq. And tasdeeq is the ratification. That's where the kayfiyya ends. From that point now, you want to understand why. So when you're asking why, you're doing what's known as qiyas, reasoning, right? So now you're actually trying to investigate what are the metaphysical aspects of the thing, why it was brought into existence. And that takes you into the ontology, the nature of the thing, right? And then that also takes you into the teleology, the purpose of its existence. That's the alam al-amr. That's where the amr is investigated. So in terms of, if you want to look at this on a human level, the human level also has the amr and the khalq portion of it. So the amr portion is the niyyah, going back to the hadith, innamal a'malu bin niyyat. The amr portion is the niyyah, and that is metaphysical. The will of the human being is not a material thing. The consciousness is not a material thing. The amr is not a material thing. It's something that's way deep down inside you that gives the reason as to why you're going to do something. So if you want to do something, you have to have a reason for it. That's the amr. It's the will to do it. The khalq portion is the amal itself, the action, and its manifestation now. Once you bring it into existence, right? You're actually bringing that action into existence, and that action is contingent on your niyyah, on your will. So you've got these two dynamics as well. That's what he's explaining here. He's trying to show you the distinguishing aspect here between the amal that the person does in the outward sense of his body actually doing an action, and the heart where the amr lies. So he's trying to tell you here that the heart is not of the khalq portion. It's not a manifestation of yourself. Rather, yourself is a manifestation of your heart. Understand? Your heart is not the thing that results from what you do. You don't make your heart makes you. Your intentions are what make you. Your decisions are what make you. They define who you are, right? So let's proceed, inshallah. On second thought, in fact, let's take a break here. Let's stop here for now, inshallah. And we can carry on from this portion in the next session, inshallah. Subhanaka wa bihamdika la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم وتب علينا يا مولانا إنك أنت التواب الرحيم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. بارك الله فيكم والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله.